F4 reported down in any of the SAR, in any of the op loss information that we had at this location. That initial 2013 excavation found 2 other parachute risers, one of which was determined to be from a personal parachute as opposed to the drag chute that the F4 uses to stop itself. That meant that at least one individual was in the aircraft when it hit. But there was nothing that came out of the ground that could help us particularly identify what aircraft, which loss, either resolved or unresolved, this was associated with. Excavation continues. We did 2 back-to-back in 2019 and early 2020. The site was excavated to its full archaeological limits. It was a righteous closure, and we've had the lab review it since then. And unfortunately, no official collaborative diagnostic materials came out of the ground, or remains, came out of the ground that would absolutely confirm to us which aircraft it was. And so the trick was trying to figure out whose aircraft could it be. The last stage that my predecessor had taken was an imagery search, looking at the site through available imagery, basically starting at from early 1966 forward to seeing if we could find something. And sure enough, he had come across an image, satellite image, that showed a crater in 1966. So it was his analysis at that point that this site could not be associated with 1781 because there was a crater at the site 5 years ahead of the lost date for Karen's father. And that's what I told her. It didn't go well. It brought me no joy to tell her that the analysis basically disassociated the site with her father. But I took solace in that we had done, it was the best analysis that I could do with the information I had at the time. Jump forward a little bit to 2023. Now we're at the AGB. And it's at this point that I meet Joseph, because Joseph tags along for it along. And we start discussing the various challenges. There's photography at the site. The photography of the site was an issue. Additionally, when I looked through the search and recovery from not just 2013, but the later ones, there were 3 pieces of unexploded ordnance found at the site that we know weren't associated with the aircraft that Karen Stedman's father was flying. An unexploded 500-pound bomb was taken out of the site. His airplane wasn't loaded with bombs, wasn't carrying any. There's a 20-millimeter shell casing. He didn't have a gun. There was a 50 caliber round, which is an American round. That typically we see those in certain instances where there's a search and rescue effort. We know there was no SAR effort for her father because he was deemed an off-the-scope loss. We didn't know where the airplane was. Even at the time, they didn't know where the airplane had gone down. So that was a challenge. And there were a few others. And so basically it came down to, again, if you caught my panel last year, my job is to be a professional skeptic. I'm skeptical of what the government knows, and I'm skeptical of what families tell me. I have to be. I try to fight confirmation bias. But this started a lengthy collaboration where I would come back. Basically, Joseph asked me, okay, what is it going to take to convince you that the airplane at that site is associated with Karen's dad? And I said, well, we've got an issue with imagery, we've got an issue with UXO, and we have to place her father's aircraft in this area. And then because there was no piece of wreckage that gave us a serial number that could really define it, we knew it was an F4D, but we couldn't say which F4D. So then we had to
jump in here.
Exclude all the others.
Is that the outsiders determined it was an F4D. And there's I think there's 182 F4Ds that were lost in Laos alone. And so you start with a denominator of 182, and then again, the thing that was dated that one of the other members of Healing Through History is here was able to determine is April 1966. So that rules out everything before that. So now we got like 157, and we went 156, 155. And most of the losses were much too far away, or they had found remains. And really what it came down to is, it came down to 2. It was either Karen's dad or another F4 case, RefNo 1405, a guy named Carter Luna. And that's where the collaboration was between Ben and I. And if there's one thing I could leave you with from collaborating on cases is that families get answers. And by answer, I don't necessarily mean that remains are going to be identified. But families get answers when multiple lines of evidence are pursued to their logical conclusion. And between Ben and I, and the information that the families have, is that we were able to collaborate for, it's been 3 years now.
At least.
And I'll turn it back over to Ben as to when we came down and told Karen, it's either A or B, and what he did to figure out that it was finally A.
Right. So I'm going to back the timeline back up a little bit. So I came with these various issues. First issue was putting the airplane, putting Captain Stedman anywhere near where this site was. That's where the Igloo White, his research on the Igloo White, you could map where those sensors pinged from his research, which was provided to us with the same academic rigor of the products that we produce. There's footnotes. There's sources that I can double check. It was of the same quality and review stringency that we do. Showed that, okay, known where his target was, here are the pings, puts the airplane in the neighborhood. Next issue is the UXO. He provided compelling explanations why each of those three things could be there, and in fact, were more or less red herrings.
Yeah, unrelated.
Unrelated.
Coincidental.
The image from 1966, I reassessed it. I had others within DPAA reassess it. It was a bomb crater, not an airplane crash. It was the crater was too perfect to be an aircraft impact. So the original analysis from my predecessor was simply incorrect. That happens. We're human. It happens. So that took it away. So then the issue became, okay, airplane could be in the right location, but we have to take out the possibility of it being any other F4D, and it comes down to two. And unfortunately, the other one was lost 500 meters away from the site that we had excavated. Close enough that given the accuracy of wartime reporting, accuracy of early GPS units, et cetera, they could be either one. This is where I went back into our records, and a gentleman named Bill Forsyth, who's no longer with us, had been an analyst for us and had done a lot of wartime imagery pulling. And he had worked the REFNO 1405 case. He had done, I looked through all of his photographic analysis, he had located the 1405 crash site and geo-referenced it, and it was 500 meters to the southeast of the site that we were excavating. So we took away the other possibility.
In 1969.
In 1969,
so
right. All of this process really just came to a head and a conclusion was just in the last few months.
Yeah.
And I'm going to, I will say association is not correlation. We still have nothing in terms of material evidence that proves concretely and irrefutably that the aircraft at site LA 527 is Karen Stedman's father's aircraft. But we can associate it now because we have excluded all the other likelihoods of what airplane it could be. And that happened only because the family, through the SCOs, was providing documentation of high rigor to me, and then back and forth we went. And if I had a question, he would tackle the problem. If he needed a piece of data, I could find it. And we went back and forth. The other really nice piece that came out, I said the site is closed, and it was a righteous closure at the time. But as the process of doing this, I discovered, for example, that parachute link from 2008 had never been considered when the site was closed because the information for it was hung on that Cessna case. In addition to that, Stony Beach has had reporting of additional life support material coming out of that site at times either before we got there, before 2013, or in some cases potentially subsequently after 2020. The end result of this is that the case cord, which just happened in May, one of the cord lines was added for me to produce an investigation proposal to go back to the site to do additional survey work beyond the boundaries of what has been dug to see if there's additional life support or cockpit wreckage for a target that we can go look for. So a positive outcome. Not a concrete answer, not a recovery, but at least there's a step forward. That's where we are.
And I would just like to say two serendipitous things happened to my family and the Beidel family, as well as other MIA families. And that was the connection with Joseph and I that we made. And the second serendipitous thing was Aunt Vivian and Grandma being at church. And Colonel Dallas Williams coming up and asking, "Are you Jim Stedman's family?" And I was a squadron commander, and he was one of 3 people that were lost. And by the way, have you heard of the igloo white sensors? And that's how we found out that my dad actually made it to his target area. So those were the 2 serendipitous things that have happened.
Just want to add one thing. If you're an aircraft lost over Laos, I have read thousands of SAR log entries, and this is the only one that ever referenced a sensor being activated. So I don't want you to think that there's all this igloo white data out there. The thousands of SAR log entries, this was the one. But it was the one piece of data that made a difference. And it's the connection between the family. So the family you have information that DPAA doesn't have, and vice versa. And then we have an outside expert and an inside expert and the family member. And we've been working together for a couple of years. And I think this is the best possible outcome given the evidence that we have at this point.
And if I may apologize, Mr. Christie, for our first interaction in Denver and me being extremely upset after waiting so long for getting imagery things and me walking out of the meeting. So I do apologize.
With good reason. And again, that might have been my first in-person one-on-one, I think.
It's too late for me to get my old job back at the museum.
So, yeah. I had been in management. I don't want to do that again. That was terrible. Again, it felt terrible. I don't like, bad news is hard to give. It was a learning experience for me. It's made me much more aware of the impact of the news that we provide. But again, given the analysis and the information that we had, we tell you the best we know when we know it. But things change, and analyses can change, and mistakes can be uncovered, and that's an example in this situation. So as a takeaway, I'll leave you with a couple in terms of these collaborations. First, we stuck to the formal lines of communication. This wasn't Joseph calling me just at my desk and there's some secret bat phone that works. This works through the Tasker system. It works through sales, works through the SCOs, and we maintain that. Both sides came with humility, came with respect, and came with curiosity. This is, a mystery to solve, and we're both interested in solving it. And finally, the independent research that Healing Through History provided, that Joseph authored, again, it was impactful because it was at that high academic level. As you might imagine, our agency gets a lot of information from a lot of different sources, and a lot of it is hearsay, and a lot of it is I met a guy who told me something, who he met a guy, et cetera. That's hard to rack and stack against material evidence that we pull out of the ground. And so when we get information from families, it is more impactful if we can see how the math was done. Show us the sources. Show us, provide those citations. We need to make sure that the homework's been done on that side as much as it is on ours. And at this point, I think you're now working on 5 other cases that I've been assigned to. So we'll be doing this quite a bit. We were doing it yesterday even.
It's a good thing we like each other.
Yeah, exactly. It looks like we've come to the end of the time, but thank you for the attention. And we'll be present at the Q&A at the end, so if there's any follow-on questions, happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Joseph and Karen, just stay right there for a sec, please. All right. Okay. And whose is this? This is for Karen? Okay.
And then Joseph underneath.
Can I give you Karen's or give Joseph's? All right.
I've got Joseph's.
I was told specifically I had to use a microphone. I've learned this since yesterday. So on behalf of the families, Karen, I wanted to thank you and present you the much coveted Vietnam War poster signed by our director as well. Thank you for sharing your story. I think it really gives hope and inspiration to the entire audience. I personally loved your family photos and watching your dad's history as you described it. Thank you for bringing your grandson with you. I think this is it's a great representation. Your family is a great representation for everybody of the continuation of the effort. It goes from generation to generation. So thank you for sharing, and it's an uplifting story. So thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. And Joseph, I think we're going to see you more in the near future. And as you mentioned, already being involved with several cases, I'm sure that we'll hear much more from you in the coming years as well. Really, in a half an hour, I know. So, and then at the Q&A. So many opportunities, right? I had the opportunity to meet you for the first time last year at the KCW AGB, and you know, I just continue to hear and see more great things, and I really appreciate the collaboration that you have with the agency. So you also, on behalf of the families and the director, I'd like to present you with your own Vietnam War poster.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Okay, let me give you a handshake there.
Thank you, Captain.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
High five. Awesome. Okay.
It's always nice to see the younger generations coming to these meetings. Okay, in many instances, past conflict accounting cases can be considered cold cases, which take on a unique and different type of thinking. To talk to you today about cold case investigations is a 38-year veteran of police and detective, and he is now the chief of police at Norfolk International Airport. He's the husband of Jeannie Huffman, whose father, Commander Jacob Edwards, is still missing and unaccounted for. Dave, come on up. Are you going to be at the podium, or are you going to sit
I'll be here. Will they advance slides?
Here's the clicker for advancing slides.
All righty.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. I am honored to be here. I think this is a room full of VIPs, and I want to make sure that I use this time wisely to share information with you. I've got a clicker here. Let's see. All right. May 28th, 1984, President Ronald Reagan. We write no last chapters. We close no books. We put away no final memories. An end to America's involvement in Vietnam cannot come before we've achieved the fullest possible accounting of those missing in action. That was said at the internment of the unknown soldier, who we know now is no longer unknown. What does the fullest possible accounting mean? It means different things to different people, to different families. Does it mean remains? Does it mean a dog tag, an ID card? Does it mean the truth about what happened to that loved one? These are important questions, and you have to ask, what does that have to do with cold case investigations? Purpose of the cold case investigation is to answer those questions. It's to find the truth. This is not a session where I'm here to beat up on DPAA or to talk about issues that we may disagree with. We agreed when we started this organization that we have to remain positive as we move forward. And if we have a disagreement or we have information that we think needs to come to light, we have no issues with calling up and having a meeting to discuss those things. The panel that you just saw is a perfect example of a collaborative effort between families, between the DPAA, and between third-party or private researchers. And that's important. Our organization uses the acronym SEARCH. And for us, the S stands for seeking an honorable accounting. We want to know the story. We want to know the truth. And we want to know what happened. We know that there are going to be some cases that there are not going to be remains, but you can get an answer about what possibly occurred to your loved one. That's an honorable accounting. The E in search stands for engaging partner organizations. The A is for advocating for families and also for holding accountable those that are charged to do the mission, which is, for us, the DPAA. The R is for research and investigation, and we spend a lot of time with that. The C is for conducting outreach and education, and the H is for honoring the service and sacrifice of our families and their loved ones. A quick example of the C and the H combined together is next week, we'll be at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and we'll be presenting awards to the ROTC Army Cadet Command. We've been doing that the last 3 years. And it's an award presented on behalf of America's MIAs and POWs. It's the next generation. So we don't want to have that adversarial relationship. We want to have a collaborative relationship. The case classifications, if anybody would indulge, how many of you are active pursuits? Can you raise your hands? Is anybody in here a deferred case? How many non-recoverable cases are in here? That says a lot. There's 1,565 now cases. About 1,000 or so are active pursuit. Just because a case is classified as non-recoverable doesn't mean that answers can't come. Just because a case is classified as deferred doesn't mean that that status can't change and become an active pursuit case. Why do cases become cold? Now, the things I'm going to talk about are not specific to any one organization or agency. These come from law enforcement numbers and law enforcement statistics. The first one being evidentiary issues. How was the evidence collected? How was the evidence handled? How was the evidence photographed? What happened to the evidence? Where's the chain of custody for the evidence? This comes into play sometimes with this mission regarding artifacts and what's the provenance of the artifacts. The pilot's helmet shows up in a museum. How did it get there? That's an evidentiary issue. Witness issues. Witnesses can be uncooperative. Witnesses can die. Witnesses can lose their memory. And some witnesses will get a better memory the older they get. I'll talk about that. Investigative issues. The biggest issue we see with cold case investigations goes back to the original team that may have been looking at that. That original investigator or the second investigator early on when there wasn't a complete array of information. And they typed up the executive summary, the case summary, whatever you want to call it, and the next thing, it's passed on to the next guy or the next gal. And they do something that computers do for us that make us extremely lazy called cut and paste. And you can cut something and move it over. And you can cut something and move it over. And as you're moving it over, you're losing information when you do that. Changing investigators in the middle of a case can become a problem. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have had only one analyst? That's a little telling too, right? Bias, investigator bias is there. I've seen a lot of police investigators that think they know everything. And also egos. That's a challenging case. I'm going to solve it. That's a great motivator, but it's not the perfect motivator. An investigator's ego should not come into play when they're conducting cold case investigations. And then finally, agency issues. Agency issues consist of things like restrictive policies and procedures. This is the way we have to do it. Even if the policy makes no sense, we've got to follow the policy. A lack of resources, a lack of expertise in a given area. That could be imagery. That could be witness interviews. Dysfunctional leadership can create a problem. Command and control or chain of command issues can create a problem. If you've got somebody within your chain of command that's not carrying the load that they should be and nothing's done to rectify that, that can create a problem, not only in that one singular chain, but throughout an organization. And not receiving clear guidance on the mission can be confusing to those that are tasked to do the mission. So again, these are general things that I've seen in my career as a law enforcement professional that cause issues during cold case investigations. Did that work? There we go. The term cold case can also have a negative connotation. What's that mean? Well, it's a cold case. You're never going to solve it. It's gone unsolved for 50 years. But then what happens the day it gets solved? It's all over the news. It becomes a different kind of case at that point. So with the negativity that can be drafted to that, in some organizations, they'll put maybe not their top people on the case. And that can create an issue. Cold cases, you need to have the best of the best working them. You need to have the people that are dedicated to wanting to get that resolution. And that brings us to the next point. What kind of attitude is important for a cold case investigator? First of all, they have to be persistent. They have to be mission-driven. They can't get distracted from the mission. They've got to be open. They have to have the ability to reassess information. And they need to let the evidence drive the case, not let their investigative theory drive the evidence, if that makes sense to you. Resist pessimism. You can get down, right, doing this job. You heard they've been working on this case 20 years, the last panel. They didn't give up. They haven't given up. It's not over yet. They're going to keep working. They're going to keep following leads. They're going to keep going back and looking at things that they thought were one thing, and now they're something different. And lastly, it's important for a cold case investigator to have empathy and sensitivity because they're sitting across from a victim. And I've sat across from victims before. And I could have had, my kids were sick, forgot to write a check to pay the power bill, my car got a flat tire, whatever. I come in that meeting with a lot of things on my mind. The victim does not care about any of that. You all get 30 minutes at the AGBs to meet with your analysts. What do you want in that 30 minutes? You want as much information as you can get about your case. You don't want to hear about somebody else's case. You don't want to hear that somebody had a problem and they're sorry they're late to the meeting. You expect everybody to be there, be on time, talk about the case, because that's your 30 minutes. You traveled here from all across the country to get it, and you're entitled to it. So those are key points for the attitude of a cold case investigator. Let's get into how we get now the title of this program, From Possible to Probable. First of all, you have to start by rejecting the assumption that something is unsolvable. There's clues out there to cases. We just have to continue to look for them, and we have to look in places that maybe nobody looked before. A non-recoverable case can move to an active pursuit case. Our family is an example of that. And I'm going to talk about some cases, and I've got permission from all the families to do that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start with our case. And it was a non-recoverable overwater loss. We spent 4 years putting things together before we had a full file case review with DPAA. And we presented. Now, what did we present? We presented a lot of information that they already had. But we put it in an order that made sense for the point we were trying to make, which is that because the plane went down in the Gulf of Tonkin doesn't mean that there can't be recoveries. I asked the question in a meeting one time, how many non-recoverable cases have you recovered? And the answer I got back was 28 or 30. So if you got a non-recoverable case back, it's kind of, we got to talk about maybe these classifications someday. So when we had our full file case review, we got a binder that was about 1/4 of an inch thick. And we brought in our file. We brought in 6 binders that were 2 to 3 inches thick. Now, when we set those binders up, it looks pretty impressive. Not everything in those binders went to where the plane went down. There's nice to have information. There's need to have information. Need to have information is what drives you towards where you're going to look, where you're going to try to do an excavation. Nice to have information explains the story from start to finish about why your loved one, your dad, your brother, your uncle was at this base, who his buddies were, what they ate for that day that they wrote home in a letter. All that kind of stuff is nice to have, but it's part of the total story. In any of the overwater losses, you likely have something in your case summary review called an at-sea overwater casualty resolution statement. And it talks about a 1973 operation that was done by the Navy. And at the end of it, due to time and money, they closed it out. Well, it sounds really kind of good until you actually read the document. They only went to about 10 or 12 sites. They were in South Vietnam, and they were designed to basically close out cases, cost $891,000. And at the end of it, the Navy said it wasn't worth the time, it wasn't worth the money. We're not going to get anybody out of the Gulf of Tonkin, and they moved on. And a lot of the initial classifications of non-recoverable or no further pursuit or whatever you want to say came out of that. There's also a difference between KIA BNR and non-recoverable. Body not recovered is not the same thing as non-recoverable. So water cases, we think there's more to do. There's ways that can be exploited. Joseph from Healing Through History has helped us tremendously with our case in charting the flight path of our aircraft, of our plane. Next up, we're going to talk about re-examining existing evidence. Look at the case folder, not just the summary. The case summary is an executive summary. It doesn't dive deep into the case. Joseph mentioned doctor's notes and things like that. That's part of it, that the case summary can help you understand what those things are. Case summaries need to be objective, views of material facts. They have to be unbiased in nature, and they have to have a perspective that focuses on facts, logic, and evidence. We had a case in a museum where there was a reported ID card, and it was reported in 2018. We went to that museum when we were in Vietnam to follow up on that, looked at the ID card, said, that's kind of strange, asked the museum, could we examine it? They opened up the case, they handed it to me. It was a photocopy. Asked them if they had anything else. They went to the basement, got the real ID. Subsequently, we worked with the family of Colonel Magnuson, and gotten the ID cards back through an exchange program we call Operation Heart with Vietnam. And now the family has those ID cards. We still don't know where Magnuson is, but we know he got out of that aircraft at some point. The IDs were waterlogged. His last words were, "I'm ejecting." So now that takes you down a whole different road from trying to find an aircraft to maybe trying to find a gravesite along the beaches. Realize that time can be your friend. In a cold case, time is your friend. You go back and look through some of the notes and things that of people that have been interviewed with your cases, and you may see early witness statements, and then there's a note from the team leader that said, "Witness unreliable, reinvestigate." And they may interview the same witness 5 or 6 times. And information he knew nothing about, 20 years later, he's given information on. And part of that reason is because the older you get, you want to go to the next place with a clear conscience. And also, other things change regarding the ability to give information. Maybe somebody's not standing over that person's shoulder while they're trying to do an interview. So witnesses can be re-interviewed. Time can be our friend there versus time not being our friend because people are dying. So cases should be reviewed as such. An example recently is when we were in Vietnam, we went to the lost site of Captain Jack Consalvo. That's a bracelet that I wear, and took his nephew with him. And as we arrived in the village, we met with the provincial leader. We asked them if they knew anything about where this crash would be, and we were looking for an individual that claimed to have found the crash. They took us right to the guy's house. He sat down with us. He told us when he found the aircraft, where it was, what it looked like. It matched the reports of the work that had previously been done by the different iterations of DPAA. And they took us to the site, and we got to get to the area where that aircraft went down. He also handed us a couple of pieces of the aircraft, and the family got those. So they had something that they were able to bring home. Whether we'll ever get to find Jack Consalvo's remains or not, we don't know. But that family has an answer, and their number one answer that they wanted was, did he go down with the aircraft? This individual, at one point, had the helmet of the pilot, and he described it to us, and he described the damage to it. And that gave that family a sense of peace, because they did not want him to be a POW. They did not want to think that for years he was left behind. And they're good with knowing now that Jack perished in that crash. Reevaluate technology. There's lots of things out there, GPR, side scan sonar. Simplest thing is Google Earth. We used Google Earth in Vietnam to locate a cemetery from a 1988 report. Healing Through History, Glenn Hines, we were doing real-time communication while we were looking for a mass grave that we believe we located through imagery, through photographs, and through Google Earth. Finally, meticulous organization. I'm old school. Our kitchen sometimes has big Post-it notes all over the walls with flow charts and link analysis and names of people and how they fit together. But it helps you sit back and look at your investigation. Get those magic markers out, get those big butcher paper down, and start writing things out. Try not to sit just at a computer screen or try to read a book and try to track all this. It's hard to do that. One of those examples is Colonel Anderson. We found a report from 1988 of some grid coordinates that were listed in a Vietnamese log. We went to that site when we were in Vietnam, and we found that it was only a mile or so from a possible location that had been previously recovered or previously checked out. That previous location was on the water line. This is further in, and it ties into more parts of that investigation about what could have happened to Natalie's father. So all of these different parts of what makes a cold case investigation tie in together to you, for you to be the advocate for your loved one, for you to become the expert on your case. You all have sat in with new analysts or new folks, and maybe one of the first things they ask you is, tell me about your case, right? So they're looking for information from you. Don't wait till next year to come to one of these meetings to see what's new. You should be doing work in between to bring new information to help DPAA and their analysts work on your case. Become a partner to them. Become an advocate for your loved one. Become that expert. Play devil's advocate against yourself. Challenge assumptions. When your loved one joined the military, your family supported him. You didn't rely on the U.S. government to do everything for you, and you shouldn't now. You should do this. You have the capability. You have the knowledge, and a lot of you have the time to put effort into this. Mission POW MI is going to be conducting some cold case investigation training for families. We're planning it right now for September. We'll be putting information out about that. If anybody's interested in that, when you see it, please contact us. We're going to be bringing in homicide investigators, former prosecutors, experts in different fields, and the idea is to kind of give family members some training that they can help kickstart their own case. So I appreciate your time, and I'll be around later for questions. All right, go this way.
So, I do have it on, but the light's not on, so do not blame me. I will use this microphone. And look, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to our crackerjack IT team back there. Dave? Dave, first of all, thank you very much for sharing your insights, your professional expertise, and more importantly, your candor. You and I have spoken about this before. I admire the fact that you hold us accountable, and I thank you for that. If there were a more dogged, more determined, more tireless advocate for you, the picture emblematic of that would be this man right here. But Dave doesn't just bring his professional expertise. What he also brings is an ability to communicate and connect with host nation officials. In the short time that Mission POW MIA have taken on this extraordinary role, and by the way, it's not just talking the talk, it is walking the walk, if not running the run. I cannot tell you how positively viewed Dave Huffman and Mission POW is by the Vietnamese officials, by the Lao officials that they have encountered. Just this last trip alone, we received accolades, we received recognition, we received admiration from the Vietnamese, our partners, about Dave Huffman and the Mission POW MIA team. I feel kind of bad because the Huffman family will have 2 of these, but I'm told that Jeannie has her office, I'm told Dave has his separate office, and that these will be utilized and not duplicated. God bless you.
Collecting everything. Get out of your way. Didn't drink my water.
Thank you very much, Dave. So our next presentation, and don't be fooled by the title, World War II and Vietnam War Analysis and how they're different. This came about because we know that there are some significant differences in the way the two conflicts are worked, but there are also some tremendous similarities. So today, to talk to you about those similarities, are once again Joseph Mortati from Healing Through History. He's going to facilitate the discussion. One of the things that we tried to do in this program was not have all just government officials facilitating the discussion. So you saw yesterday with Dr. Holland, and today we've got Joseph coming back to facilitate this discussion with Dr. Owen O'Leary and Mr. Josh Frank. Come on up, gentlemen.
Good morning again. Looks like I didn't get the memo about gray suits, so I apologize. So you already know who I am. You guys want to introduce yourselves?
I'm Owen O'Leary. I've been with the agency for 19 years. As I mentioned yesterday, I've got a lot of field missions to both Vietnam and Laos. At present, I am the field sciences manager for the laboratory, and the one-sentence explanation of what I do is it's my responsibility to make sure that our organic field teams, when they are out doing work, whether that's an investigation or a recovery, that all of the science is being done correctly. That's fundamentally my job.
And I'm Josh Frank. I'm the new Chief of Research in Hawaii. My counterpart in D.C. is Matt Kristoff. If everybody knew Bob Mays, Bob Mays retired last year, and I'm the one that's taking Bob's place. Like Owen, I've been around for about 20 years. I was first a soldier and Vietnamese linguist at JPAC from 2007 to 2010. Loved the mission. Knew I didn't want to do anything else in my life, so I got out of the Army after 12 years, like halfway to retirement. Over halfway, I got out and got a civilian job, and I've been here since January of 2011. My job is to make sure that the researchers are ready to go into the field and that the information we're gathering in the field makes sense to tell Owen's folks where to dig.
Great. So in keeping with the other facilitators, when we started planning this panel a couple weeks ago, I thought I would start off with a really softball question. Why are Southeast Asia identifications so difficult? Yeah, it's kind of so you've all heard that something like 70% of the operational budget goes to Southeast Asia, which is about 4% of the total identifications that are done by DPAA. The majority, as you might imagine, I might expect, are World War II and Korea, and the majority of those are disinterments from cemeteries that are controlled by the United States, and of course that doesn't happen in Southeast Asia. So what I thought we would do is start off, and this is kind of piggybacks on what Dave was talking about, the different categories, is let's take a breakdown, let's look at a breakdown of the analytical category. Now obviously some of these numbers, it's now 1565, and a few cases have changed status. But I thought it would be good to take a look at how big the problem to be solved is as an entry to our discussion. So you can see in the breakdown of non-recoverable, there's 64 ground losses, there's 75 water losses. These are not aircraft that were lost over the water. These are people that were lost in the water. So a small craft washed off the back of a ship or something like that. And the bulk of those are aircraft losses. And the majority of those are over water losses, which there's been some discussion on quite how difficult they are. Those are non-recoverable. There's about 86 that are deferred, meaning there's not enough information to determine whether they're not recoverable or active pursuit. And they make up about 40% of the total Southeast Asia cases that DPAA has on their plate. So if your family member is non-recoverable deferred, you have virtually no chance of getting remains identified. That's just the stark reality of how difficult this mission is. That leaves about 60% that are in active pursuit. So that's the key number, and those are believed to be recoverable. So let's take a look at the breakdown of what those look like. This is called a pie of pie chart. So that small pie chart to the right sums to 100% of the blue. And again, there's 14 water losses, there's 226 ground losses, and then again, not surprisingly, the bulk, about 3/4, are aircraft, and there's 756 people that are missing in 455 aircraft. But we got to break this down one more level, and that is there's a category called off the scope. These are aircraft losses for which There isn't a last known position. Aircraft took off from an aircraft carrier in the middle of the night, was going to fly 500 or 600 miles to the target, disappeared somewhere between there. And this is not a formal category, but there's about 100 people in about 60 aircraft. So this is the problem to be solved. And we wanted to do this to talk about how difficult this mission is, how why Southeast Asia is so much more difficult than World War II. And in doing so, we came up with 3 important questions. And the first question is, where? Where did things happen? And I'm going to turn this over to Josh to answer this one.
Right. So you'll see a big map on the screens. You've got a bunch of red dots and you've got a bunch of blue dots. So the red dots are all incidents that involve a missing service member. So every one of you have a family member who's represented by one of those red dots. That's our best idea right now of where we think they went missing. All of those blue dots are the loss of an aircraft, the loss of someone who's not missing, but it's an incident that we still need to keep track of, and I kind of want to explain that. The number one question we're trying to answer is where are we going to find your person, but we also need to know where other things happen so that we can exclude things. So if you think of what a researcher at DPAA is supposed to do, like the essence of our job is to find a place on the ground to tell the lab, this is the place that we need to do a survey, this is a place where we need to do an excavation. In a lot of cases, right, it's really, really easy to see your case and hone in on the case that we're there to investigate, but we really need to know about everything that happened. So we need to know about the blue dots, even though nobody's missing from those. We need to know about planes that crashed around a town, whether nobody's missing or not, because if we go to a little village in Vietnam somewhere and there are 4 F-4 crashes, but only one of them has a missing person, we have to make sure that we're going after the right one, not the one, and we don't want to put a site on the dig list that we're going to spend years and years and years digging, and it's been the wrong one all along. That kind of goes into witness statements, right? We were talking about witnesses earlier. If we're talking to an 80-year-old person who saw a bunch of stuff against the war, we can't expect them to be the ones that can compartmentalize the information we're trying to get. We have to know enough about everything that happened in that place to do that compartmentalization ourselves. We have to know that when they say X, it's this thing that happened over here. When they say Y, it's this thing that happened over here. And when they say Z, that is the one that we want to go to make sure that we're being as efficient as possible. And that takes research, right? From my standpoint, we should take information from anywhere that we can get it, whether that's imagery, whether that's records at the National Archives, whether that's from any of you who want to send stuff through your SCO to us, books, anywhere that we can get it, and our job is to refine those dots. So you see a dot right now, it might not be a dot, it might be a circle, and our job is to take information to make that circle smaller and smaller and smaller until Owen or one of his guys is standing there.
Yeah, so the question of how to get to where is primarily handled by the Indo-Pacific Directorate and Josh and Matt and their teams, whether they're in DC or Hawaii, and they work together back and forth. And then I have 3 archaeologists and scientific recovery experts who are embedded with the Indo-Pacific Directorate and work on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis with Josh and Matt's teams to be the archaeological interlocutor to the historians and the analysts, right? So we're helping look at, okay, so how many losses of this particular type of aircraft are within 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers or 30 kilometers, right? How many other possibilities are there, right? Has everything been run to ground on the research side of the house? Do we think and concur with Josh's team that we think that if we go out to a place, we've got a good chance of recovering remains, right? Or we've got a good chance of finding a site out in that location. So there is working together like that. There are differences between working Vietnam cases and working World War II cases. A very important thing to impart is that all don't think of World War II as a singular block of cases, right? World War II Europe is very, very different from World War II Pacific. World War II Europe has records. The Catholic Church has records. The Germans have records. The Italians have records. Mayors in Austria kept records, right? And so that provides a source of information for that. But World War II Pacific largely doesn't have any of that. The Japanese burned huge swaths of their records at the end of the war. Papua New Guinea, everything is by oral history, which creates an entirely new and different aspect to interviewing informants and witnesses, right? Even though it's 80 years old, that's a whole different aspect as well, right? That touches on some of the things that Mr. Huffman was talking about interviewing witnesses on this last case. Other things about where are, does the historical record that Josh and the analysts have pulled together make sense archaeologically, right? Another big aspect of this where is how what we know from the written record, the historical record, and what can we interpret from that to move on to how we're going to conduct our field work. There's a lot of those details that you talked about, Mr. Huffman, which isn't a need to have, but you'd be surprised at what some of those nice to haves actually do become important. It might not be something that is going to tell us exactly where to go, but it's going to help us after we get there a little bit. I suppose another real important aspect to touch on here, Josh, is GPS grid coordinates and the difference between the GPS grid coordinates you might see in some of the very early paperwork documents that were created right around the time of the loss incident versus GPS grid coordinates that we see today.
Right. So, you know, they used an India tie or various types of datums during the war. And I think for us, what we really want to do is if we get a grid coordinate in a record, we should be going to the National Archives, pulling that exact map that they were using when they were doing that and using that map to get to the right spot. The other thing I'll say is that right now, we've been working a really, really long time on record loss locations that might have been moved in 1975, 1976. And I don't necessarily, I'm 7 months into this, I don't necessarily trust the original record loss location. I want to go before that. I want to see the after-action reports that an infantry regiment might have put out. I want to see operational reports from the Air Force History Office down in Maxwell that might have said what route this plane was actually taking. I want to see, you know, Marine records that say, you know, where a platoon was. Situational overlays, day-by-day maps that show where platoons were hour by hour, minute by minute. S3 journals that just keep a log of what a unit is doing every day. I want to use those and get back to that point and then see how far off this record loss location might be. And you know, when we started doing this in 1988, when JFFA started to go out, we were very largely working on those record loss locations that were already in the system from JCRC. I'm going to be honest, I'm not 100% sure that those are right. I want to go before that, double check that. And the sad part is that we could have been working from a wrong coordinate this whole time.
Yeah, I think it'd be important that the record loss location has a lot of different meanings. So in some cases, that was the last known position of an aircraft. And again, it could be hundreds of miles from where it was headed. In some cases, the record loss location, there was a survivor on the ground or we know they were captured. So the record loss location doesn't have a strict defined meaning. So why don't we move on to the next question? So we talked about where, and Josh also talked about this yesterday. He was done an excavation in Italy, I believe. So we've covered the where. The next question that we came up with that we thought was important is the what. So once you figure out the where to look, or you get pretty close. And one of the things that I learned a lot from these two gentlemen in preparation for facilitating this is that what happened in the field, I read the reports, but it was kind of a black box to me. I knew they went and they dug and stuff like that, but I really learned a lot, so I appreciate that from you two. Why don't you take us through what happens when you actually get to the field? What's the process and what comes out of that?
Sure. I talked a bit about this yesterday, right? What happens, what we do, we go out and do a survey, right? We're trying to find the size and shape of an aircraft crash debris field, and then we move on to bulk excavation. The what here is also what are the circumstances of the loss incident, right? It's a very broad question, but it really is the starter question after you think you have figured out a big piece of that where, right? So it can be as general as, is it an aircraft loss? Is it a ground loss, right? That's the very basic starting point, right? And if it's an aircraft, well, let's go to ground losses. I know we talked a lot about, there's big numbers for aircraft crashes, but I don't want you to think that we don't pay attention to ground losses as well. So is it a ground loss at a fire support base just south of the DMZ, right? That is a very different type of ground loss than a SOG patrol, the SOG Long Range Patrol, Special Operations Group, thank you, that some gentlemen were flown out to the Lao border in a helicopter. The helicopter set down and they were going to go spend a week out there isolated by themselves, maybe 3 or 4 guys. That's a very different type. Those are two very different types of ground losses. Those individuals that are out there on their own, right, those longer range situations, that's very different than a World War II case where if you think of like the Battle of the Bulge, something real famous, or something on Guadalcanal where it's a big open pitched battlefield and it's the Americans versus the Japanese fighting across battle lines with hundreds and thousands of guys. Hürtgen Forest is another great one in Germany. That is very different than 3 guys out in the jungle on their own, right? And that's one of the things that makes Vietnam harder. What are the circumstances of lost aircraft, right? We typically think jet versus propeller, and that is a general consistency, but there are aircraft that were built and primarily used in World War II that were still in use in the Vietnam War, right? The C-47 is the classic example. It was a cargo aircraft in World War II, and it got turned into the AC-47D, the very first spooky gunships. But it's still the same airframe. So when you approach that loss incident that has that type of aircraft, you're going to approach it like it's a World War II plane, because it is, right? A-1s, another great example. It's a big propeller plane with a big propeller on the front. It's not a jet aircraft. That's going to function more like a P-51 from World War II. And so we're thinking about that. And we're working, what is the circumstances of loss? The nice-to-haves, right? Do we know that somebody always had a watch? It was a really special watch that got given to somebody. Do we know that somebody always carried a Lucky Charm on them, right? That's nice to know information that you can provide to us that could possibly help us down the road when we're running an excavation. Before we move on, I do want to touch on the photograph I chose, right? We take thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of photographs every year of the field work we conduct all around the world. And I wanted to put this one in because I wanted to touch on the attention to detail, right? That is an American hand and a bunch of local worker hands in Southeast Asia working on a high flow wet screen. That wire mesh that's in the bottom is specifically sized, that is custom manufactured so that the holes are small enough that you can't have a tooth fall through, but just big enough to be able to allow us to push dirt through at the highest rate possible without being able to miss a tooth, right? That level of attention to detail is the type of field science that we are doing to make sure that we can be as efficient as possible to process as much sediment as we can while still making sure we're not going to miss something that's really important.
I'm going to say something really quick about investigations, too, the investigation process. So I know Owen gave his number yesterday, and just so everybody knows I know what I'm talking about, I've been on 58 missions since 2007. A lot of them, most of them investigations, which means I had to work very, very closely with the archaeologists or anthropologists out in the field with us. We're trying to gather 2 types of information when we're doing an investigation, right? One is historical information, so the circumstances of loss, that all has to make sense, and then what we're gathering from the sites that Owen might survey, right? The goal of that is to eventually put it on our excavation list, and we need different things from each other to prove that this is a good enough, we have enough evidence to place this on the excavation list. So it's a constant back and forth between us the entire time we're in the field about, hey, Owen, what do you need to get you to this point? And Owen's asking me, hey, what do you need to get you to this point? Is this one of those where we have so much good information that just the information itself, if we can prove that this is a crash site at all, it doesn't even really matter what kind of plane it is. The information is good enough that if it's a crash site in this place and we know that it happened on this day, we can get that on the excavation list. If it's one where I don't have a lot of historical information, I don't have that circumstantial kind of evidence to back it up, we might need to pop a few more hits when we're doing our metal detector survey to find a part that shows this is the right kind of plane. Because if I can't say that this is an F-111 instead of an F-4, then we got a problem. So we might have to do a little bit more survey to make sure we're getting the information we need. And it's just a constant back and forth between us when we're in the field.
Okay, and then the last question, and maybe the one that's most important to the families in this room and us elsewhere, is when? When am I going to get an answer? And as Dave pointed out, an answer may not necessarily be that your loved one's remains come home. So if DPAA were to do 8 identifications a year, it would take them over 100 years just to work through the active pursuit list. So I know this is a tough question, but when can families expect? And also, keep in mind that World War II is what, 74,000 on the count for?
About 72, I think.
72,000?
71, 72.
So this is probably the hardest question of all. When do I get an answer?
I mean, it largely depends on the budget and stuff right now, right? You know, if we look at the brief that Mr. Phelps gave yesterday, and you saw that trending line down, well, we were talking about what that meant money-wise, but you know, the other part of that is what that means operations-wise. And so, just for example, when we're humming at our highest level of budget, we can do 24 activities in Southeast Asia. This year we're doing 16 or 17, and next year, right now, funded, we have 8. So that's how many activities we can do. We have 176 sites on the master excavation list right now. So if our budget stays to the point that we can only do 8 a year, and we know that there's a time lapse between how long it takes to excavate a site and how long it takes to investigate a site, we're constantly adding more cases to the master excavation list faster than we can close cases that are on the master excavation list. So, and if it takes more, I think you said maybe 5 or 6 digs average per site?
It certainly can, right? We can go out, and after we've done all of the historical research and we've put something for an investigation mission, right? Like we just came home from, on 10 June, we just had a investigation team that was in Laos. They got home on 10 June. It's possible that in one trip in the field, we can do enough work to gain enough information to put something on the master excavation list. But when we get to excavate it, sometimes it takes 5, 6 excavations to complete it. But you can only go to some sites, you can only go to them once a year because of the weather window, right? There are certain parts of Laos and Vietnam that you don't want to be in at the wrong end of the year because it's just going to pour rain on you the entire time, and you've just sent 15 guys to Vietnam, and they're not going to be able to work for 40% of the mission because of pouring rain. So that's obviously not a good use of resources by us, and it's not good for you. So you go dig the site when you can on 4 Laos, which is always in the May to June timeframe, and then you've got to wait another year to get back in there. But on 5L and 1L and 2L and the rest of them, you're just in other spots in the country working on other cases, right? And as many cases as we can, given the resourcing that we have.
Right. I mean, the 3 of us had great conversations getting ready for this, and we kept calling kind of some of the conversations we were having. Joseph kept calling it the elephant in the room, right? Which is, you know, what do we want to do, and what do we know we need to do versus what we're actually capable of doing. And again, like the budget plays into that. The number of people we have play into that. We have expeditionary support has 11 dig teams, so we have 11 teams that can be deployed at any point during the year. So even if we got this huge budget, if we don't have the personnel, we don't have the teams to put out on the sites, we still have a place where we're kind of capped. We do get, of course, help there from partnerships. So, if partnerships can get out and do some underwater stuff for us, they can get out and they can do excavations and maybe even extra research for us. So we do have some help in that regard, and they can pull from outside very easily for us. But there is a cap to what we're capable of doing, no matter how much money we have.
Okay, so I'll give you the final word, or before I wrap up?
Again, the photos were intentionally chosen, right? And this is from July last year, so about a year ago, and this was the funeral at Arlington for United States Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Donald Downing. This is where we want to get you. I want to get you here. We want to get you here. Everybody in this room wants to get here, and we're working at it. I promise we're working at it to try to get to here.
So, gentlemen, thanks for your time. I appreciate you. I've been doing this for 20 years now, and I learned a lot from these two guys about what actually happens in the field. And I want to say thanks to DPA for asking an outsider to come up and moderate a panel. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Okay. The next topic is addressing some prominent myths. And over the years, there have been stories about such things as the acidic soil in Southeast Asia, the difficulty in accessing archives, the warehousing of remains. So today, Dr. John Bird, who is our scientific director, is going to talk to you a little bit about the acidic soil. It's titled something I can't pronounce, so I'll let him, as a scientist, pronounce certain words. Mr. Chris Phelps, who you heard yesterday, I think everybody in the room probably knows who Chris is by now, and Mr. Matt Christoff. They're going to discuss these topics with you now. Gentlemen?
Okay, I'm going to go first, and I'm just going to go from up here because I'm going to point at some things on the slide. But I was asked this year to talk about this issue of preservation of remains in Southeast Asia, and something that we have thrown around for many, many years, just kind of loosely when we talk about acidic soils. So my presentation is, so what about acidic soils and preservation in Southeast Asia? In paleontology, anthropology, archaeology, and to some degree forensics, such as forensic pathology, there's a field called taphonomy, which is the study of how tissues, biological tissues, are preserved over time, and why tissues are not preserved over time in certain circumstances. And so we are interested in taphonomy naturally at DPAA, and we've initiated a couple of studies recently, one by Dr. Nicolette Parr and our data team, which I'll come back to later, our laboratory data team, looking at our cases in Vietnam over the long run since the late 80s, and what the completeness level is with them. And then the second is being led by Dr. Denise Toe, who's looking more broadly at what kind of environmental circumstances we're encountering in Southeast Asia and how that's going to affect remains preservation. The ultimate goal in taphonomy is to develop models that allow you to predict when you should expect certain tissues like bones and teeth to survive, to be recovered, and when you should not expect them to survive, to be recovered. We're not at the point of having models to predict that yet. I'll just say that up front. But we are looking at it more closely. Last month, I was in Korea doing a joint forensic review of remains, and I've been doing joint forensic reviews for more than 26 years. I've been doing them in Vietnam for now 26 years. I've been doing them in Korea since we started doing them there in 2007. And so I've been looking at the remains that are going to potentially come to the lab for years, for decades. And I've seen what we get under what conditions over a long, long stretch of time. Last month, I'm in Korea. I'm looking at a case, and it's nearly complete. And it's an American soldier who died in 1950, and there's a lot there. We don't often see that from Vietnam War cases, so that's kind of what we want to explain a little bit. So is preservation of remains simply a matter of time? Well, it can't be, because you can go to the Smithsonian over here and look at dinosaur skeletons that are more than 65 million years old. Some of them are up to 200 million years old, and there they are. You know, they're fossilized, but they are skeletons that survive. So it's not just a matter of time, you know. But all other things being equal, longer time is not good. You'd rather recover the remains after a shorter period of time than a longer period of time. But when are all other things equal? Almost never. So let's talk a little bit about soil pH. This is a map of Asia showing you soil pH, and acidic soils are indicated by red, neutral by white, and more basic by the blue. And you'll see that Southeast Asia is pretty good dark red there. And you can see down here is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. I don't want to shoot Chris in the head.
Without an eye.
Over here, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is pretty red. But I was just talking about Korea. So what about Korea, where I just looked at a pretty complete skeleton? Right over here. Well, it's red too. And the fact is, the soils in Korea are pretty much as acidic as the soils in Southeast Asia. So soil acidity simply is not the only explanation that we have to have for poor preservation. How about precipitation? Maybe it just rains more in Southeast Asia. Down here, you can see the deep purple. But if you look at the Korean Peninsula, it's also deep purple. So precipitation is similar, and both areas have kind of a wet season and a dry season. A little more pronounced in Southeast Asia, but not enough to really be an explanation. One of the things I'll point out is that we know that alternating wet, dry conditions are terrible for preservation. So having a wet season, dry season is not real helpful. This is a close-up of a case in the lab. This is a Korean War case, but this is a case that came out of a casket. It's buried as an unknown in the punch bowl. And when this individual was buried, it was in very good condition. Buried in the mid-1950s, excellent condition. What happened? Now it's in terrible condition. What happened is that eventually the casket rusted through on the roof, and water in the wet season in Hawaii would go in and fill up that casket, and then it would drain back out. And then every year, for year after the hole rusted through, you get this wet, dry. And look what it does. It gets wet, swells, cracks, then it dries, and the cracks start to fall apart. Always dry, though, can be really good. This is a picture just off the internet of a 7,000-year-old mummy sitting out on the ground surface, been that way for 7,000 years in the desert at high elevation in South America. Always wet also can be very good. Yesterday we talked a little bit about underwater sites, and I said the laboratory loves when we get underwater sites, when remains come in, so does AFDIL, because we've done very well. In fact, this is a graphic that Denise Toe in her study put together with help from AFDIL, looking at our success rates going back to the 90s, back when the extraction protocols at AFDIL weren't nearly as good as they are now. And all along, we've just had really good time getting full DNA profiles, sequences out of remains that have been in the water all the time. If they've been in seawater, we desalinate them before we send the samples to the DNA lab. But if you do that, the preservation is outstanding. So always wet's good, always dry's good, but wet, dry, not good. Terrible. Average temperature, though, is where you start to see a huge difference. Up here in the green is temperate. And Europe, we're talking about World War II cases a minute ago. Europe's going to be like this. North America's like this. Temperate, you get a cold winter. In Korea, you get a long, cold winter. But not down in Southeast Asia. Warm all the time. And you can see the red color of Southeast Asia down there. So there's a notable difference. And this is just showing you a picture of Korea in the wintertime in the upper right, and Southeast Asia in the lower left. Looks like that all year round. That's Vietnam. So another factor that is more important than soil chemistry is what lives in the soil. Believe it or not, dirt is not just dirt. Even though we don't like to get it on our clothes and we try to wash it off and think of dirt as dirt, dirt's not just dirt. Soil is actually a living ecosystem. And there's a lot of things living in soil. And if you look at what lives in soil, a lot of them like to consume bone and will consume the bone if given the opportunity, particularly bacteria and fungi. And in Southeast Asia, there is more diversity of these microbes in the soil than, say, in the Korean Peninsula or Europe or North America by orders of magnitude. And there's more numbers, meaning just the quantity of these organisms in the soil is orders of magnitude higher in Southeast Asia. And so you think about why that would be. In Korea, you know, these critters basically get shut down when it gets cold, and they stop operating. And they wait till the warm season again, and then they can start consuming things again. But in Southeast Asia, they can consume away nonstop all year round. And this is a big problem. Talk a little bit about the qualities of the bones themselves, because that also matters. Long bones, which is often what we recover, or at least pieces of long bones, they're like a cylinder, or think of it like a pipe, and they're pretty strong and pretty durable when complete and intact, but they're often not complete and intact. And so let's think about what qualities, particularly if we were going to try to develop a model to predict whether we expect remains to survive in certain conditions or not. We have to think about, well, what can we measure about bones that would be useful? And the most important aspects to measure are the mass and the surface area. And just for illustration of the meaningfulness of surface area, I have the picture up there. There's a marble. It's this marble, which I can throw around and it doesn't break. It's pretty durable. But then there's a pane of glass there. Now, what if I threw the pane of glass on the floor? Shatter, right? But those two items have exactly the same mass, and they have the same volume. What's different about them is how that mass gets distributed with the surface area. And so just in terms of its inherent strength, these two variables matter a lot. But also, if you think about the problem with acidic soil getting in contact with bone, the more surface area there is, the more area there's going to be a chemical reaction against. And with the microbes, the more surface area there is, the more access the microbes have to the bone to consume it. So surface area makes a big difference. When bones get fragmented, it has an impact on the surface area. So here on the left, you see just this is from our training collection in the lab. These are bone fragments. And you can see when long bones get fragmented like that, they suddenly have a whole lot more surface area than if they were complete, like a pipe. And both sides of each fragment are vulnerable to be attacked by acidic soil, by the chemicals in the soil, but also by the microbes. Teeth are more compact. And so when you look at teeth, especially the crowns of the teeth, they have a more compact shape, and enamel is the toughest material in the body. And so teeth have the best chance of surviving all kinds of onslaughts. And that's the reason why many times when you see the identifications that we're making in our laboratory from Vietnam cases, it's identification of teeth. There are many occasions. There was an ID we made last year, just before this meeting last year, and all we recovered were teeth, but it was enough to make a positive identification. Teeth are very durable, and the crowns of the teeth are most durable of all. So this is a chart that came from Dr. Parr's study. And this is showing you, looking back to the late 80s, how complete were the cases that we identified over that span of time. And the red line kind of curves down and then across. That's the trend line. The dots are the data points. And generally what you can see is that for the last 10, 15 years, we've been dealing with very little remains that were available to us in the laboratory to identify. And that's despite complete recovery efforts. And the reason is because of preservation issues. And so this is kind of our reality of dealing with it. Now, when you look at this and you go back to my question of time, is it time that matters? Well, what it is really, it's the rate of degradation that matters. And the rate of degradation is higher for our Vietnam War cases, generally speaking. And that's why we make it our priority. That's why it's Mr. Phelps's highest priority, as he showed you yesterday, is because we have to get after these more aggressively because time is not on our side because of the rate of degradation that we're dealing with. On this chart, there's a couple of exceptions at 2010, way up there. This was a case I did the joint forensic review on back then. And this was a case that's kind of illustrative of special circumstances can lead to better results. This was a case that was in the middle of nowhere on the Lao-Vietnam border. It was a slow-moving observation plane, like a little Cessna-type plane, 2 individuals in it. When the plane went down, it kind of hung up in the tree canopy, and the remains of the two individuals never actually got down into the soil. And because it was in such a remote location, no one had scavenged the site. So this was a really good situation for us. Another that's in our lab right now is an underwater recovery we've been doing now for a couple of years, and we have a lot of very complete skeletal remains from that site that was coming out of the water. Many complete bones, like I would have seen in Korea last month. But that's another special circumstance. It was in the water the whole time. So these are the kind of the factors that are involved. And acidic soil's not good. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying acidic soil is good or doesn't matter. It's just that it doesn't explain the difference between our Vietnam cases and our Korean War cases and our World War II cases in most circumstances. So with that, I will yield to my colleague, Mr. Phelps.
All right, thanks, Doc. So again, hello, good morning. Chris Phelps. I have no slides, no science, no PhD. I'm the dum-dum of the group that talks about operations and research. So research. I'm preaching the choir here a little bit. Research, I think everyone knows, is the foundation, the bedrock of everything that we do in the Indo-Pacific Directorate, also in the European Mediterranean Directorate. It tells us the why, what, where, where do we go, where do we expend resources in the field. Yesterday I referenced in the Indo-Pacific Directorate roughly about 165 employees. That includes everybody. That includes the detachments. I include everybody, my contractors, my GS employees, my local nationals. They're all part of the team. So that's roughly, so about 165 or so members inside of the Indo-Pacific Directorate. Roughly about 78 are analysts or PhDs or don't have a PhD, but they're involved in the research. So if you do some quick math, that's nearly half of my manpower resources are dedicated towards research for the reasons that we all know too well. And there are a million ways that we gather information and research. One way is we get research and we're provided information by people in this room. And then we have analysts going into NARA. We have analysts reading books and going through archives. And there's a million and two ways. The part that I'm going to talk about right now is archival breakthroughs or archival research, and specifically in Vietnam. So we have had access into the archives in Vietnam sporadically over the years, right? And our detachment mainly would get into the archives, but it was nowhere near the frequency and to the level of which that we wanted to have that access. Something really important happened within the last year or so in Vietnam, where they opened up their archives and such to any citizen in Vietnam, right? So as I guess mundane as that may seem, of us being Americans in this room, that's a big deal in Vietnam. So that's one thing that I just wanted to brief and talk about. But what does that mean to us? I mean, that means that we have more access as well. I was just in the Archives 3, the National Archives in Hanoi back in February. I mean, Dave Huffman was there just a few days ago, really. And just share with you, it was pretty. I mean, it was my first time there, but it was pretty neat. I mean, we had a full brief. They took us down into the belly of the archives. We were put on a little white suit and rubber gloves and such, and it was, and it wasn't just all show and pomp and circumstance. I mean, it was They were just showing us how they preserve documents, national documents that are important to their country, and artwork and things they have. But then they also walked us through the procedures for access for the things that we want to look at. And there's all kinds of things, right? I mean, from journals to maps to whatever. And talk to us about the procedures. And I won't bore you with all of that bureaucratic stuff, but they explained all that to us. I want to give a little bit of credit to my detachment in Hanoi and Det 2, who has for a very long time been pushing with their counterparts, the VNO, SMP, our counterparts, for this topic. Every year we have, as I think everyone in this room probably knows, we have the annual technical talks with the Vietnamese, also Cambodians and the Lao. For the last 5 years, this has been a topic of access to archives. I mean, we're a broken record, but the answer is always no if you don't ask, right? So we're continually bringing it up. And the detachment has been pushing that as well. So a long way of saying, I think we're in a good place. The next mission that goes out in Vietnam, 26 TAC 4, we had not planned for this. Yesterday, you heard me say a term of operational flexibility. So what we did when all of this was starting to come to light, we built in a archival research team of a few researchers that are coming from Hawaii that will embed during that joint field activity window. And they're not going to the field, they're not doing an IT, they're not doing an RT as an investigative expert or what have you. They're going into the archives and spending, just like if they went over in Maryland to NARA. So, so this is all, I think, good and trending in the right direction. And now, and you heard me say yesterday, I'm the eternal optimist, but I'm also a realist, right? So, so I think it's fair, again, in the interest of transparency, to temper and manage expectations, because archival research, just like any research, and you all in this room know this so much better than I, it's time. It takes time. It's a laborious process. And just like any other tool in the toolbox, whether we've talked about imagery or what have you, it's not the end-all be-all. It's not the panacea. It's not the last piece to the 500-piece puzzle that was under the carpet that you just found, and there it is. It's one solution to a complex problem, and it will take time, but it's trending in the right direction, and I'm optimistic where we are today with access into the Vietnamese archives. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Matt Kristoff.
Okay, thank you. Today I'm going to talk about storage of remains. And I'm going to reference a document that was published by one of our predecessor organizations, DPMO, the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office, back in June of 1999. It's called Vietnam's Collection and Repatriation of American Remains. And it's about 47 pages. I'm not going to read that report. I'll give you some highlights from it. It's available at the Library of Congress. But there's some things that I wanted to highlight from this report for you. So you could call it storage of remains, you could call it warehousing. We should really talk about this topic less as Vietnam's warehousing of remains and more about Vietnam's effort to collect American remains, and I'll tell you why. So when American troops, conventional forces, first started arriving in Vietnam, roughly around 1961, the Vietnamese already had a set policy where they were supposed to document the deaths of foreign personnel. They were supposed to do three things. One, document the deaths of foreign personnel, bury the bodies, and then to maintain those graves. And for the most part, depending on where you were in the country, they, especially up north, they did a pretty good job of that. From the early 1970s through 1983, Hanoi reiterated this policy several times to their provincial officials. And I'll stop here for a moment. This report was published by DPMO, but it was the collective effort of what were at the time three separate organizations. DPMO, Joint Task Force Full Accounting in Hawaii, which became JPAC later when they combined with the lab, and the lab, Central Identification Lab Hawaii. So those then three organizations cooperated on this report in conjunction with what they described as unprecedented cooperation from the Vietnam Office for Seeking Missing Persons. So from 1996 to 1999, that 3-year period, they worked on this, and that's where this data is coming from. So the Vietnamese had a concerted effort starting in the 70s through about 83 on doing this. The question is why, right? What was the impetus for this? What was the driving force? Well, the Paris peace talks started in 1968 and went through 1973. And the Vietnamese government already knew from their previous conflicts that when those conflicts came to an end, there was going to be the repatriation of prisoners and remains. So they expected that. So they started getting their ducks in a row for when this effort would start at the cease of hostilities. So they were mostly successful in the northern provinces. We have documentation from 23 of the 26 northern provinces at that time. When this study was put together, they had a lot of documentation from those 23 out of 26. The results in South Vietnam and Cambodia were much less. They were drastically lower. They didn't have as good control of those areas at that time. And at the time of this report, there was no evidence for any Vietnamese collection of American remains from Laos. So numbers. When they went into this, they were trying to get good estimates on how many numbers are we talking about, what's possible, what's reasonable. And the assessment going into it was it's possible that upwards of about 300 sets of remains could have been stored or warehoused. And they rounded up to that 300, realizing that they were doing so, but they said upwards of 300. And when they started digging through all their data, they whittled that down a little bit. A window of 270 to 280 is what was looking as being more accurate than the rounding up to 300. So the effort in North Vietnam, since they had more control and they started a bit earlier, they were pretty much done with collecting these remains up north by the late 1970s, according to our data. Down in the south and in Cambodia, that continued until about 1983. So I'm hoping the report gets this next part right, otherwise Dr. Bird's going to jump all over me. But according to the report, the Joint Forensic Review started in December of 1988. Close enough? Okay.
Yeah, they were less formal until the early 90s.
Right.
When they became a formal kind of.
Okay, with caveat. Less formal until the early 90s. So for the purposes of this estimate, think December 88 for the first one. By late 1998, so that's a 10-year period, the first 10 years of these joint forensic reviews, they reviewed almost 2,400 sets of remains that they determined to be non-American. So 2,400 over 10 years is about 240 sets a year. That's a huge effort by everybody involved. So you can tell that the cooperation was intense. It was a lot of work for both sides, especially scientifically. And you could see the effort that was being put into finding American remains when they discovered, just in their first 10 years of doing this, almost 2,400 sets of non-American remains. So at the end of the study, the evidence indicated Seal High's the findings of Seal High scientifically, physical evidence, they determined that 219 sets of remains showed physical evidence of some type of storage. They also admitted that remains don't always show evidence of storage if they were stored. And on the DPMO side of the house, evidence from sources, witnesses, documents, they found evidence of about 274 sets of remains that were stored. So they were hitting in that window of 270 to 280. And again, if you have more questions, more interest in this report, Vietnam's collection and repatriation of American remains, June 1999, and it's available at the Library of Congress. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Y'all can just leave your microphones there. So that brings us to a conclusion of the morning session and our lunch break. We are scheduled to come back to this room at 1:15, so if you would be in your seats around that time, we have a full schedule this afternoon. Thank you very much and have an enjoyable lunch.